Day number 2, Social Security Administration Amendment, continuation of Cashless Welfare Bill 2020, resumption of debate on the second reading and on the amendment moved by the member for Barton.
Thank you. And the question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I give the call to the member for Dunkley.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Today in this parliament, in the legislation that we debated before question time, during question time and what happened just before I rose to speak, we have seen this government reveal its true, heartless colours. We have seen this government once and for all put paid to their marketing slogans that they're leaving no Australians behind, and if they ever again try to stand up and say that they're the ones that are making sure that Australians can get through this time of COVID and the recession, then they will have egg all over their faces. You know what we've seen today, Deputy Speaker? We've seen a government strip the power to increase New Start from its own minister from March next year. We have seen a government say, sorry everyone that we've been telling how great our initiatives are, how wonderful we are because we've helped people live above the poverty line during COVID. We're just going to stop doing that in March. We don't care that the Reserve Bank Governor has said that it's going to be a lumpy and bumpy recovery. We don't care that Victorians are still struggling. We don't care that in communities like my community of Dunkley, unemployment has doubled this year, and there's more than 10,000 people getting job seeker and more than 1,000 young people getting youth allowance. This government today has said, we don't care about any of you. We don't care that the prospects of getting a job between now and the end of March are pretty slim. It's okay, though, because we've got a slogan called Job Maker. We don't care about that. And the worst thing, Deputy Speaker, about all of this today and the votes that we just had is we know that there are members of the government that voted against what they believe in today. We know that there are members of the government who have said publicly that they think that New Start has to be above the base rate of $40 a day. We know that there are nationals that go home to their electorates and say, we're the ones that represent the poorest people in Australia, we're the ones that stand up for the unemployed, but today voted for those people who don't have a job to go back to an unemployment benefit at a base rate of $40 a day. They stand up and say, oh, it's wrong, it's wrong, it's wrong to say $40 a day. You're all lying, all you Labor people, because there's all these extra supplements. Go and talk to an unemployed person about what it's like to try to live on the base rate of $40 a day on unemployment benefits, which is below the poverty line. So we saw that happen. We also had one of the most unedifying spectacles in question time that anyone could imagine. I was ashamed to be sitting in this chamber watching the Minister for Social Services not answering questions about robo-debt today and showing an utter contempt for this parliament, for the rulings of the Speaker and, most importantly, for the people of Australia. Utter contempt. No sense of taking responsibility. No remorse for the people whose lives have been damaged and have ended because of an unlawful scheme of averaging income to issue debt notices to people which they had to prove were wrong, that were sometimes 7 or more years in the past. And we know that people have taken their lives. And we had to sit here in question time today and hear a minister refuse to answer questions and try to say that, oh, well, you know, there's this press release from 25 years ago that means that, well, if someone said they were going to do something similar in the past, don't blame me for doing it now. I mean, everyone surely was told by their mum, when you're caught doing something wrong, don't say, but they did it first. Seriously, we're not children. We're elected representatives to the federal parliament, entrusted with the privilege of looking after people who need our help. And that's what we got. That's what we got in question time today. The minister should be ashamed of himself, and anyone who supports his behaviour should be ashamed of themselves, and all of those ministers in the government that were part of implementing robo-debt and telling Australians that if you didn't pay back an unlawful debt, you would go to jail, should be ashamed of themselves. In any other government, in any other Westminster system around the world, ministers would take responsibility and a government would fall over that, but not this government. They want to strip away supplements and put people back on $40 a day at the time when they need it the most. They won't take responsibility for robo-debt. Apparently it's okay to spend $1.2 billion worth of taxpayers' money on something that you didn't do and you're not responsible for. And now this legislation that I'm speaking on today, they want to introduce a mandated racist scheme on Australians' First Nations people. Today in this parliament, we have witnessed the true colours of this government and the ideological nastiness upon which they are based, and the cowardness of those who don't agree with it to cross the floor and vote against it. This legislation is racist legislation. It will impact 34,000 people in Australia, 23,000 of whom are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people. 23,000, more than 18,000 people in the Northern Territory. 68% of people who will be forced, and that's an important word, forced onto the cashless debit card, are First Nations Australians. And of course reasonable people would think, well, it must be because this will work. It must be because the government has seen what's happened with the pilots, with the trial, and has said this scheme is something that is making people's lives better. This scheme is something that is helping people to get into employment, that is helping people to deal with mental health or alcohol or drug issues that they have. This scheme is helping people, and the people are grateful for the help. That's what you would expect would happen before such a drastic and draconian policy such as telling people that they can't spend cash and choose how to live their lives would be implemented. That's what you would think. That's what I would think. It's not the case. It's the opposite. Auditor General's report from 2018 demonstrated that the government had failed to show that broad-based compulsory income management works. And this government asked the University of Adelaide to engage in an evaluation of the trial sites following a botched trial in 2018. Cost $2.5 million, this evaluation, $2.5 million, which would make a big difference in a lot of electorates, including mine. And of course, you would also expect the government to pay some attention to that evaluation that they paid $2.5 million for. Again, no, it's the opposite. This legislation was introduced into this parliament before that report was finished, before the minister read the evaluation. It estimates, the minister revealed she still hadn't read the report, and the Minister for Indigenous Australians said he did not need to see the report to support making the trials permanent. I guess he doesn't need to listen to the evidence that has been given by Indigenous people, by First Nations organisations, for those who have lived with the cashless welfare card either, to make the decision, because if he had and if they had have read the report, we wouldn't be standing here today trying to stop this government from implementing a racist policy. implementing it on First Nations people, not with First Nations people, not at the request of First Nations people from Seduna and Goldfields and East Kimberley, Bundaberg, Hervey Bay, the whole of the Northern Territory, not at the request of them, implementing it on them and to them, regardless of what they say. We know that this sort of program can work. Income management can work. It needs the community to be part of it. It doesn't work when you just force it on people. In some situations where child protection is involved, it can work. In communities that have said we want to do this and we want to work with it, it can work. But that's not how this government is approaching this issue. They are saying, you will do this because we know better. That's what this government is saying to First Nations people across Australia, to the 68% of people who will be subjected to the cashless welfare card under this legislation who are First Nations people. We will tell you how to live your lives because we know better than you do. On the 12th of February of this year, the Prime Minister introduced his new Closing the Gap targets. People will recall that. It was a big moment. He talked about it quite a lot in the media. There was a lot of attention to it. This is what the Prime Minister told this parliament, this chamber, when he did it. And I quote, "What I know is that to rob a person of their right to take responsibility for themselves, to strip them of responsibility and capability to direct their own future, to make them dependent, this is to deny them of their liberty, and slowly that person will wither before your eyes. This is what we did to our First Nations people, and mostly we didn't even know we were doing it. We thought we were helping when we replaced independence with welfare. This must change. We must restore the right to take responsibility, the right to make decisions." That's what the Prime Minister told this chamber in February of this year. Exactly. And now with this legislation, the Prime Minister and his government are doing the exact opposite. The exact opposite. What is the definition of hypocrisy? What is the definition of hubris? What is the definition of knowing better than everyone else? How can the Prime Minister, the Minister for Indigenous Australians, come into this parliament and say that they will, for the first time ever in the history of Australia, take an attitude of working with Indigenous Australians, with First Nations Australians, not doing things to them, and then bring in this legislation in NAIDOC week, no less, last week, which does things to First Nations people. It's breathtaking. But it's just the third thing this government has done today to say to vulnerable Australians, to say to Australians that look to the government for support and assistance, we know better than you. We know better than you. And they don't. We shouldn't, in this country, have people who are living in poverty. We shouldn't, in this country, have First Nations people whose living standards are a shame and a blight on our country. We are, as everyone says, a generous people. We are a prosperous country. We have people in this parliament who are good people on both sides of the chamber who want to be part of First Nations people designing and implementing programs that assist their future. But yet we are being asked to talk to and vote on legislation that takes away autonomy and goes right back to saying, we know better than you do. And worse than that, says, thanks so much for telling us about your experience. Thanks so much for telling us that this doesn't work. Thanks so much for coming, giving us your time and your experience and your wisdom about what it is that you want for your communities. But shut up now, because we know better. Well, I won't be part of it. And I tell you what, I won't be part of this legislation being the stalking horse for a cashless welfare card going across the country applying to everyone, and neither will my colleagues on this side of the chamber.
I thank the member for Dunkley. The original question was that this bill be now read a second time. To this, the honourable member for Barton has moved as an amendment that all words after that be omitted, with a view to substituting other words. The question now is that the words proposed to be omitted stand as part of the question. I give the call to the member for Bass.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I'm rising today to speak on this legislation to outline my concerns surrounding the program and the potential implications of making it permanent. I welcome this opportunity to detail why I think it is not the best way forward. To be clear, I'm not at all seeking to condemn those who want this program in their communities. They are not in any way without empathy or care, and indeed I know them to be good and decent and caring people. And I do believe that they want the very best for their communities, to see individuals thrive. There are also community leaders who do support this program for the same reasons. But I note from the recent research that there are others over the years since the rollout who have backed away. Whilst I concede that there are measures in this bill which are an attempt to address the stigma that surrounds individuals in this program, these measures miss the point. Stigma is not just external or how our society perceives someone. In all the conversations that surround stigma, we fail to recognise the internal or felt stigma that people experience, making them feel other and less than due to their circumstance. Despite the proposed changes, so much damage has already been done, with many recipients reporting separate lines in supermarkets or an inability to shop at some stores at all, as referenced in the recent Senate report. If that doesn't make you uncomfortable, it should. There are countless reasons why someone may need government assistance. Certainly, after such a tumultuous and difficult year, many Australians are sadly experiencing for the first time what it means to be without work. Our government has responded accordingly with appropriate measures that are temporary, targeted and scalable. This program should and could have the same approach, perhaps utilising the card as a temporary tool targeted to people who have demonstrated that they need assistance on a fixed-time basis, with the appropriate support to transition. Applying a broad brush to all recipients in the current sites, no matter their circumstances, is harmful and unhelpful. There's a high level of anxiety that exists elsewhere in the country beyond the 3 trial sites. Certainly in the northern Tasmanian community that I proudly represent, I've had distressed people ask me, including pensioners, if they will end up having their income managed. And with the amount of time and money spent in addressing the current challenges of this program, it is difficult to believe that this program will end with these current sites. No matter your circumstance, relying on government assistance is difficult, not only financially but mentally and emotionally. I have been a recipient of government assistance myself at different times in my life, and I can understand the distress that so many forced onto this card would feel. This system of income management strips away autonomy and a sense of pride, no matter how well-intentioned. Governments imposing control in this way is not a fix to the myriad of issues driving disadvantage, and at best it is a band-aid. Whenever you approach a human problem by inciting shame and guilt, you have already lost those that you are seeking to help. The rhetoric that surrounds social security and systems like income management plays into the very worst of human nature. We're essentially inviting people to look at their fellow Australians as something other or less than. That's not the Australia I want to live in. I'm standing here as I believe in an egalitarian society and equality of opportunity, and dividing our society into us and them is not the Australia we should aspire to. I also have a fundamental problem with how this program and this legislation aligns with my own principles. As a Liberal, I believe in personal and individual responsibility. It's the very foundation of our core principles. We work towards a lean government that minimises interference in our daily lives. Forcing the cashless debit card program onto people unless or until they can prove to the government that they can manage their own finances is antithetical to these principles. Do these principles only apply if you're not poor? I believe we're better than that. It should be pointed out that mutual obligation measures are already in place for those needing government assistance, and it's appreciated that a range of such measures is expected. However, the level of intrusion imposed upon recipients of this program is overreaching. The cashless debit card program is a punitive measure enacted on the presumption that all welfare recipients within the trial areas are incapable of managing their finances and require the government's assistance. I acknowledge that some communities are more likely to experience generational disadvantage and have generally poorer outcomes in a number of areas, and these are all good reasons for the government to provide assistance to address these problems. It is, however, not clear to me that the cashless debit card program is the best solution or even a good solution to address some of these systemic issues. Of course, we should be looking to address the substantial challenges of intergenerational disadvantage, and we shouldn't shy away from that, but I don't believe that this is the way. One mother of two in Hervey Bay told the media she understood what the government was trying to do. She says, and I quote, "I understand where they're coming from. Growing up in a high drug and alcohol area as a child and having been a victim of parents not doing the right thing," she said. She goes on to say, "But they don't need to punish everyone. The fundamentals don't work, and it's not targeting the right people. When I have to call people to complain about her transactions being declined, and I have anxiety, it's quite upsetting and it's stressful." Deputy Speaker, just doing stuff to our communities is not the same as helping. You will always get better results when you empower people to do things for themselves. If we truly want to move the dial on intergenerational disadvantage, we need to address complex issues like trauma and put in place a range of effective evidence-based programs that work to address the issues that keep communities in poverty. It's claimed that the cashless debit card program is delivering significant benefits in the communities in which the trial has operated. The cashless debit trial evaluation and final evaluation report indicates that those benefits are limited in nature and scope and do not demonstrate an overall improvement in the conditions which the program is intending to address. I do acknowledge that the report found some reductions in the consumption of alcohol, illegal drug use and participation in gambling by program participants, but it's not clear that the program delivers meaningful change long-term or just controls behaviour in the immediate sense. There is just not enough evidence that supports that this program is a game changer for these communities and the individuals placed on it to justify the associated harm that it causes. The program has also been presented as a solution to many issues. However, it casts a wide net that, in my view, punishes recipients as a collective rather than having regard for individual circumstances. It places the burden of demonstrating the ability to manage your finances on the individual, thereby making the default assumption that recipients are incapable of managing their finances. This only serves to stigmatise and marginalise recipients and doesn't fundamentally address the wider issues. In doing so, it also drives assumptions that addiction, gambling and domestic violence only occur in disadvantaged communities, and we know this is untrue. The cost of trialling the cashless welfare program has amounted to more than $80 million since 2015. It's somewhat ironic to me that you can essentially have an income management assessment trial for half a decade that can't show conclusive results, but yet there are a number of evidence-based programs that cost far less and that have demonstrably worked. Programs like Healthy Georgetown, rolled out in my hometown, an area recognised for high rates of disadvantage and where I served as mayor. Together with Lucy and Penny from Healthy Tasmania, we fought for a minute amount of funding, $150,000, for 10 years, and I was thrilled when the federal government funded the program last year. In less than 12 months, this program has delivered over 1,000 hours of healthy lifestyle activities to hundreds of locals. The Healthy Tasmania team has also rolled out the Healthy Quit program to 8 participants, with 3 quitting smoking entirely, and all significantly reducing the number of cigarettes smoked per day. In just 7 weeks, participants saved over $2,000. The same group has also rolled out Healthy Shed initiatives at a local men's shed, with a focus in improving the overall health of participants. 100% of participants said the program made them more confident to manage their own health, and 50% of participants said that by the end of the program they were feeling less depressed as a result of their involvement. Of course, these programs are also not a magic fix to the systemic issues that exist in areas where there's significant disadvantage, but it is evidence-based programs like these that play a critical role in addressing the issues that can keep individuals from being active participants in their own lives. Implementing a range of programs and initiatives to support communities where disadvantage exists can make a difference, and probably at a fraction of the cost. I find it extremely disappointing and frustrating that we would look to support income management systems like this, while not addressing the reprehensible practices of payday lenders, seeking to manage people's income on the one hand, while on the other hand allowing highly predatory payday lenders direct access to our most vulnerable. This is a complete contradiction, and a damaging one at that. We must move to investing in long-term solutions that create sustainable and meaningful change. The very concept of this type of control of our communities is anathema to me. But the immediate challenge that we have is, what's the alternative for these trial communities right now? With just a few weeks of the year left, there is a great deal of uncertainty for those who have been on this program for a very long time. And there are not alternative payment structures in place, so to just stop it in its tracks will potentially cause further disadvantage. After such a long trial phase, it would require some work to transition away from it again, and I will continue to advocate for that to occur. And it's the only reason I'm not voting against this bill today. In my first speech, I stated that I want to be a genuine, authentic representative for my Northern Tasmanian community, and that I would fight for better outcomes for every single person I represent. This type of program will never be accepted in my community, and I want to make it unequivocally clear today that any proposed future expansion of this scheme will not have my support. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
I thank the member for Bass for her contribution, and the question as put is that the words proposed to be omitted stand now as part of the question, and I give the call to the member for Lawler.
Well, thank you, Deputy Speaker. And as the member for Bass leaves, I want her to take with her the feeling in this chamber as we listened to that incredibly measured, considered, informed speech. We're all standing here one after the other today, and we have done repeatedly around the cashless welfare debit card on various forms of legislation across the last few years, as it has gone from a supposed trial where communities have been consulted and have agreed to be part of it, to something much, much more draconian. And we are always individually trying to capture, I think it's fair to say, what the member for Bass just captured so beautifully. Like the member for Bass, I have been a recipient of the support systems in this country. As a single mother with 3 children who worked part-time for a period of 6 years, I was a single mother in receipt of support from the Commonwealth. I completely understand the comments that she made about the shame, about the stigma, about how it feels to stand in a Centrelink queue, about how it feels to have people look at you as if you are somehow different or other than others. I would put on the record something that I think sums up that feeling, and I think it's legitimate here, although we have to contextualise that. We live in a large country, and we Southerners have not had a cashless debit card placed on us. Yet, exactly as the member for Bruce says. But on this side of the chamber, and so refreshingly from Tasmania, the member for Bass joins us in seeing what is happening in the north and questioning its validity, and questioning, most importantly, the stigmatising aspects it has on the populations that it is put upon. So my story goes like this. As a single mother, paying a mortgage, working part-time, 3 kids, 0.6 teaching, doing my load across 4 days because I really wanted to teach year 12, so I didn't want to work 3 because that would have precluded me. I was a recipient of welfare. And I remember, distinctly remember, I was going to paint my house inside, and a kindly neighbour, a great friend, said to me, "I'll help you do that, Jo. I'll help you paint the house." And he relayed to me that in another conversation, another friend of a friend had said to him, "Why are you helping Joanne paint the house? It's not her house, she's a single mum." And when I spoke to that person and pushed him, he said, "Well, I think it's a bit rich that you're getting taxpayer dollars and you're paying a mortgage." Now, take it in, folks. The things we say in this place, the rhetoric we use, has impacts in the suburbs, in our communities, the assumptions, the things that we suggest about people. And this legislation is one of the worst examples of that I have seen, not just in my 7 years in this parliament, in my time on this planet. It makes me ashamed to be Australian that we're even discussing this, that we are prepared to have a discriminatory piece of legislation that discriminates in geography and it discriminates in race. And there is no way around this. The communities where this is targeted know that. The rest of Australia knows it. And you only need to talk to a pensioner that hears about the government's working group to understand they know what it means, because they say to me, "So we're going to be discriminated against too." They know who's being discriminated against, and they know what it means. So I stand here today, thrilled that the member for Bass has the courage of her convictions and her life experience, the courage to stand up for her community, but in doing so to stand up for every community across this nation, and to say that supporting someone and helping someone is not about taking their choices away. Now we know, we've all read the reports, we've all read the reviews, we've all read the assessment from the University of Adelaide. We know that this system is completely and utterly flawed. We know that it's rolled out with one hand to control someone's spending under the guise of saying you shouldn't be spending money on alcohol, you shouldn't be spending money on cigarettes, you shouldn't be spending money on illicit drugs. Well, there are laws to stop people spending money on illicit drugs, and the member just said here, well, sorry, I drink, and so do most Australians. It's not illegal in this country. It is not illegal in this country. Sorry. I am sorry. I'm sorry. I come from a community with lots of low socioeconomic people who drink and smoke, perhaps too much. Perhaps too much. We are not in this place in a position to hold ourselves above the people we represent, and that's exactly what this piece of legislation does. It says we are better than you. It says it's legal to drink alcohol, it's legal to smoke cigarettes, but not if you live in certain parts of the country and not if you're of a certain ethnicity. Then it's the wrong thing for you to do. And you know what else I want to say about what the member for Bass had to say and what was so refreshing in this place? It was so refreshing because I've been here for 7 years and I've listened to those opposites speak on bills related to the cashless debit card on more than one occasion, and I have left this chamber disgusted, because what is lacking over there is an absolute fundamental understanding of poverty and what it's like to live in chaos. You know, we've got teachers all over this country. We are trained in this. It's a really simple thing. Really simple. We go into classrooms to work with kids who may have come from a chaotic home this morning. And right now, with the recession, some of those homes that have been stable will at this point in time be chaotic, where people put bills on top of the fridge hoping they'll fall down the back so they don't have to think about paying them, who are wondering about how they're going to pay to get the hole in the roof fixed. Sound familiar? Where does this come from? Where's the worst case for housing in this country? That'll be in remote communities. Where do we know that these things are happening intensely? In remote communities. If you do not understand this lived experience of living in poverty, if you do not understand what it's like to not know where next week's income is going to come from, and if you think that putting something in place to control someone's spending is going to fix that, you're mad. You're mad. This is a government that cut funding for financial advice, that cut funding from people in my community where they could go and get a financial advisor to assist them to do their budget across the next 6 months so that they could get some relief from the stress of poverty, so they could get some relief and get their heads above water so that every night they weren't feeling so crushed. Every night they weren't feeling so desperate, and every night they weren't wondering how on earth their life was ever going to change. Putting the cashless debit card into these communities doesn't change that feeling, it entrenches that feeling. It entrenches a feeling of worthlessness, and it doesn't support. This card does not support an addict getting off a drug. All of the studies have told you this, but you persist. And you leave me absolutely distraught. As the member for, as my friend, and as my other colleagues have pointed out, there are lots of ways that we can help people. There are lots of ways that we can support people. But when someone willingly comes to the table to seek that support, we know the outcomes are almost guaranteed to be effective. And in the communities that this is being rolled out into, that this legislation suggests will occur, all you're going to do is increase stigma. The member for Bass mentioned something that I hadn't read yet, and that was the notion that there were different queues happening at supermarkets for those with one card and another. Now, I know personally, we've all had that, haven't we? Haven't we all had in the supermarket where we've got our PIN and you're standing there with a basket of groceries, and what's the first thing you think? You don't think, oh, the whole supermarket will know I forgot my PIN. What you think is the whole supermarket thinks, I've got no money. That's what you're fearful the whole supermarket thinks. So if the studies had supported this, you might have convinced some of us over here, but it hasn't. The minister conceded that he hadn't even read the report, hadn't even read the review that cost millions of dollars. We sat here earlier in the year on Closing the Gap Day, and I was appalled. I was appalled listening to the Prime Minister because I thought that he was this close. In fact, he was suggesting that we should reduce the targets because we hadn't reached them. Now, I'm from a place in education where we work on targets, we work on data. And the last thing you do is go, oh, that looks a bit too hard, let's make it a bit easier on ourselves. Imagine if our schools did that. Imagine if our schools did that, Member for Bowman. You'd be in here yelling at them every day if they did that. If a school said, oh, we've set these targets, they're way too high, we need to make them a bit easier. But that's what the Prime Minister was suggesting in here on Closing the Gap Day. It's all too hard, let's reduce the target, let's make it easier on ourselves. Or worse, let's scrap them. Then there was a bit of a change of heart and there was a different tone. There was a different tone. And the Prime Minister came in here and made a speech about not doing to. Remember? About doing with. Well, let me tell you, the communities that this is focused on, they tell me that this, here it is again, it's about us and it's done without us. It's going to be done to us. It is, under no circumstances, something that should be happening in this country, in the country that we all love. It just shouldn't be happening. We shouldn't be in here debating this. This program should not be being expanded. The trials where they have evidence that they are working should be reviewed again to see if they're still working. Because fundamentally, this creates a system where some Australians are different to others. Different in economic terms, different in social terms, and are seen differently by their government. There is no way around this, guys. There is no way around this. There's only one way this is perceived anywhere in Australia. They see the discrimination in this. They are appalled by the discrimination in this. And even those who thought, let's give it a go and see how it goes, are saying, where's the evidence to say it's working? Well, the evidence is not there to say it's working, but we're going to expand it. We're going to increase the number of people that are included, and we're going to increase the number of people that are being seen as separate and different and other by the Australian government. So what's the point of any constitutional conversation about who's Australian, who isn't Australian? Why do we bother closing the gap when, with the other hand, we bring in discriminatory legislation that clearly discriminates on geography and discriminates on race, just purely on numbers? And I'd close my remarks to say that it's another situation where, on this side of the House, we continue to stand up for people. And I'm pleased to see the member for Bass has come in here tonight and spoken from her conscience and stood up for Australians across the country. I'm disappointed that the member for Bass said that she wasn't actually going to vote against this bill, because I think it would have been symbolic, and I think there are others on that side who would have stood beside her if she'd chosen to do it. And I wonder, and I'm being very cynical, but I wonder if this is not the moment that the pairing arrangements that we have in place for COVID do not shine a light on the fact that members opposite may be outside when we vote on this tonight, because they've asked to vote on it tonight, when the member for Bass is paired out of this room. Sorry, but you need to know that that's what's happening, because if you didn't know in your party room, then you need to know now. So we're going to vote on this tonight, and the member for Bass is going to be paired out of this chamber. So all of the people who think that the COVID regulations can't be used this way and that it's still representative shines a light on that as well. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
I thank the member for Lawler for her contribution. The question is that the words proposed to be omitted stand as part of the question, and I give the call to the member for Cooper.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak on this important bill, the Social Security Administration Amendment, Continuation of Cashless Welfare Bill. And I want to add my voice to the support for these amendments that my esteemed colleague, the member for Barton, has circulated. And I think it's worth noting once again, in the middle of this debate, what those amendments are. They note that 13 years after the Howard government's so-called intervention in the Northern Territory, there's no evidence that compulsory broad-based income management works. The minister decided to make the cashless debit card trial permanent before reading the independent review by the Adelaide University, and this proposal is racially discriminatory, as approximately 68% of the people impacted are First Nations Australians. And it calls on the government to A, not roll out the cashless debit card nationally, and B, to invest in evidence-based policies, job creation and services, rather than ideological policies like the cashless debit card. And the member for Bass outlined a number, in her own electorate, a number of such policies that could be used instead of the cashless debit card. And we've heard by many previous speakers the problems with this card. Deputy Speaker, Labor does not support this bill. It is in essence a racist bill. It's an ideological bill. It's a bill developed without an evidential base. It is a bill that impinges upon human rights and freedoms under the guise of fixing serious social issues. But in fact, it is a bill that actually creates more problems than it purports to fix. It's a typical Liberal Party response that is punitive and that taps into negative populism, entrenching bias and disadvantage. We on this side of the House were profoundly disappointed to see that the government brought this bill forward for debate in NAIDOC week, a week where we celebrate the achievements of First Nations peoples, appreciate their resilience and recognise their struggle. As a non-Indigenous woman, I take my cues and I learn from my esteemed colleagues, the member for Barton and Senators Dodson and McCarthy, when it comes to First Nations policy and legislation in this place. I listen to the people in the First Nation communities in my electorate, and there are many. And I hear the voices of First Nations people nationally, particularly through that seminal communique, the Uluru Statement from the Heart, a statement that Labor is committed to enacting. And what they've taught me is that listening and talking is important, but in truth, it is only part of what must be done. What is equally important and harder to do is taking action, actually doing the hard work of reconciliation. The Liberals talk a big game when it comes to reconciliation, but when push comes to shove, they are not there to do the hard work. It's just like we saw last month in the Senate, where the Liberal Party voted against a motion to hang the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander flags, and again they voted against that during NAIDOC week.
Minister, are you rising on a point of order?
Yeah, this on relevance. This bill has absolutely nothing to do with race.
Your point of order is not upheld. Continue, please.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, because as we know, this bill, as has been stated time and time again from members on this side of the House, does actually affect more Aboriginal people. It is discriminatory, because as a percentage of people that this affects, First Nations people are disproportionately represented. And now you're pushing through this legislation, which is an incredibly clear example of policy being done to First Nations people and not with them. This bill will make the cashless debit card permanent in the existing trial sites of Ceduna, East Kimberley, the Goldfields, Bundaberg and Hervey Bay. It will permanently replace the Basics card with the cashless debit card in the Northern Territory. The bill will also replace the Basics card with the cashless debit card in Cape York and extend income management in Cape York until 31st of December 2021. Now, Deputy Speaker, I acknowledge that the community of Cape York is running a unique situation with community management at its heart. It is a system that is not replicated across the country with the use of this card, and we have long stated very clearly that if people want to be on the card, that is their right and is not up to Labor to stand in the way. But it has to be done with full and informed consent. I can assure you that there has not been full and informed consent in any of the other communities as far as I can see, in terms of what the government is intending to do in relation to this card. As the member for Barton said, the agenda is very clear. It is a continuation of the disdain that this government holds in relation to people who need to rely on social security payments. Now, it is true that the bill will make it easier for people to volunteer to be placed on the cashless debit card and allow a person to remain on the card when they move outside one of the prescribed areas if they want to. But it also enables the Secretary to make valued judgments about people far from their view, in another world, disconnected from anyone they know, to revoke cashless debit card exit provisions. They can decide that they no longer believe the person who exited the card is reasonably and responsibly managing their affairs. And we hear time and time again that applications to actually come off the card fail, that it's almost impossible to be allowed to come off, despite showing that they are managing their own affairs, that they are reasonable people. They should be allowed to come off the card, and we know that it is virtually impossible. So few people are allowed to come off. And in a fairer world than that run by the Liberal government, of course, coming off a card wouldn't be necessary, as you wouldn't be on one in the first place. So you might assume that a bill this far-reaching would have an incredible weight of evidence backing it in. Well, you'd be wrong. Adelaide University has undertaken a review of the cashless debit card, an independent review by a reputable institution. Yet in Senate estimates, the minister was forced to admit that she had not read the review by Adelaide University before she and this government decided to make the cashless debit card trials permanent. Unbelievable. It just says so much about this government's callous disregard for people's lives that they could press ahead with this without paying attention to the facts, without paying attention to the evidence, without paying attention to what is actually going on in people's lives. Just yesterday I was speaking about the Family Court Bill, and the government did a similar thing here. They put together a whole piece of legislation that ignores all the evidence. And the result? We have legislation that does exactly the opposite of what this country needs. So given the government doesn't seem to be aware, let me outline what some of the relevant research has found. Researchers from 4 universities said in a report released in February this year that they'd uncovered an overwhelming number of negative experiences stemming from the card, ranging from feelings of stigma, shame and frustration, to practical issues such as cardholders simply not having enough cash for essential items, or important things like paying for your child to go to school camp or buying the little things that they need to do so. It's no wonder the community has been incredibly vocal on the issue of cashless debit cards. They know it is in its essence a racist program, one that disproportionately targets First Nations peoples and takes away their agency, their control over their own money, their lives and their families' lives. 68% of those affected by this bill are First Nations people. I've had hundreds of emails on this issue, with people describing it as blatant discrimination, harking back to paternalistic colonial policies that we'd all hoped our country had moved beyond. I'm lucky to represent an electorate which is home to 12 First Nations peak bodies, and their position has been united and clear on this issue. They've told me no one should have this program forced on them, that this program is one which so clearly represents colonial attitudes that they struggle against every day, that it is yet another example of the government telling them that they aren't equals, that they don't deserve to have control over their own lives, that they need oversight and patronising paternalism of the government to survive. Deputy Speaker, I'm humbled to be here today in my position of privilege, to be able to amplify the voices of the people that have come to me as their elected representative,